So, well, first of all, thank you very much for inviting me to this seminar. I'm very excited for being here, especially because it's such a different audience than what I'm used to. And I think that this can lead to a very interesting discussion during after the presentation. I'm Andrea Álvarez Laorden, and I'm a PhD student here at the Institute of the History of Science in la Universitat Autònoma de Barcelona. And as Samuel said, I'm doing my PhD as member of the project Climasat, which is a history of science and technology project that delves on how remote sensing satellite data is contributing to make what we conceive and how we conceive and act on the environment. And our topic, it's very connected to what we are doing today, because the objective of this talk is to present or to reflect collectively on how history of science and technology can help us problematize environmental data or climate data. I have decided to focus on environmental data and climate because I thought that it could be more relevant for your group. And I will mostly use case studies from satellite data historical investigations because it's what I'm more familiar with. But of course, there are many more other research that is interesting. And if you have any question, just please raise your hand. So with the talk, I have divided it into parts. First, I will present some case studies, and also I will make kind of a literature review of how historians of technology and science reflect on data and how we study it, how we conceive it. And later, I will turn to a more practical side on how can we do it in practice, right? Because some of you, I know that also are engineers that perhaps you work with data every day in more a scientific way. And I also found interesting to share with you what historians and other scholars think that we can practically do to see if it can be helpful for your work. So to start, I would like to, for you, if you could say what is the first word that comes to your mind if you think about data. For example, in my case, this would be objective. I don't know if someone else wants to say something. Okay. Otherwise, usually the hegemonic.
Sorry.
I don't see you, so please go ahead because I don't see you.
I raised the hand. But maybe to my mind it came field work, collecting, the act of collecting data.
Okay.
And I don't know, I think about a big amount of things when I think about data.
Exactly. Perfect.
I was saying the same, Samuele. One thing that is coming to my mind is the large amount. No, if I do 2 interviews, I would not say data probably, but 100 interview I would. So there is a how can I say, a quantity.
Okay.
It's relevant for me.
Good. So if anyone else wants to join, I can follow. So usually, yes, what we think when we think of data, sometimes we think, as you said, Samuele and Marco, of big data, of big amounts of information, usually is linked to immaterial. The case that Juicy posed, usually I wouldn't say that perhaps it's the hegemonic view of data, right? Because usually it's not linked with people, it's more immaterial, it's neutral, it's objective, it's self-explainable, right? And it can allow us to make informed decisions, but we sometimes don't know exactly who is behind data. And also now with big data, we also hear a lot about how this big data can bring a revolution. So we have all these words that are and conceptions that are linked with data, the hegemonic view of how data is thought. But historians of data argue that no, that data is not neutral, it's not objective, and it's material. But before moving on, when I mean here that data is not objective, I don't mean that it's false or that someone is always trying to trick us with data. Only I mean that data is made in a specific context by specific people. No? So data, as Donna Haraway would say, must be situated. And this is what I mean by data not being objective, no? So here in these pictures, we see different ways of approaching data that as the ones that I showed before, and we see perhaps more historical range of what counts of data, also different devices and different actors that I have grouped in some questions that we as historians ask ourselves when we think about data. One of them would be, for example, in which historical context is this produced, right? Because it would be different to think about census data with punch cards here on the picture below, or if this data is done in California offices of Google. Also, another important question to ask is how is this data, for example, produced, but also distributed, shared, displayed, and many other data practices that are involved in the production and circulation of scientific knowledge done with these tools, right? For example, if we think in the how, it's different if we use old computers or new computers, but besides the material aspects, we can also think in which epistemological value has the person that works with data. For example, it could be different if an environmental group would present some results on river pollution that if this is done by a European environmental agency, just to put some examples of how the conditions of who makes this knowledge can influence. Other questions that are relevant for historians would be, why is this data used? And I just put here the example with the cookies, that sometimes we don't know where our data comes from, and this would be something that we would like to reflect on. And finally, the who. The who as being one of the most relevant questions to ask when we think of any data set that we encounter. So all these questions that I was posing here, in the end, converge into the conception that data is connected to power, right? As I've written here, the production, storage, analysis, display, circulation, and use of data must be contextualized and studied in relation to the power relations they reflect or reproduce. Because both the infrastructures that are needed to produce and collect all this data and can be built in asymmetrical power relations, and also the way that data is disseminated can also reinforce or challenge, in some cases, some of these practices. To summarize a little bit what I was saying, I very much like this sentence from the political geographers Jenny Goldstein and Eric Noss, which shows also that besides historian, there are many other disciplines that are dealing with how we critically study data. And they say that against its dominant representation, data is material, is governed, is practiced, and requires practice. So to ground a little bit all these conceptions about data, I would like to explain a case study that Sarah Pritchard published in 2017 in a paper called The Trouble with Darkness, because I think that this example shows quite pedagogically, or at least visually, how these different ways of displaying satellite data can influence on how we act and how we think about the environment. So her investigation revolves around the publication of this image here, that it was published by NASA the 5th of December of 2012. And this image was called City Lights of Africa, Europe, and the Middle East. And in the text that accompanied the image, NASA scientists said that this image provided a global view of the human footprint on Earth. And this human footprint that they meant was light pollution. Because as we can see in the image, this dark contrast between light and darkness, it raises the question of how cities, illuminated cities at night, can pollute the skies. And further, as Pritchard investigated, they even eliminated all natural light sources, as for example, fire or bioluminescence, making it a more stark contrast between places where there's no city lights at night and therefore they are not polluted, and places where there's many light pollution. So with this, what NASA was doing with this way of displaying the satellite data was trying to promote an image of the environment at night as a problematic with environmental pollution. But there's a bit more. What NASA was also doing was promoting a way of acting to this light pollution. And we can have the answer to this question in the historical context in which NASA published this image. So the 5th of December 2012 was almost exactly 40 years later that NASA published this photograph that is called the Blue Marble. That is an iconic photograph taken from Apollo 17, which shows the Earth. And this image has been very, very important in movements on environmental protection. And NASA knew this, right? So when they published the image of city lights, that also it was called dark marble Sirius in clearly relation to the blue marble. What they were doing is to place this image of city lights in the tradition of the blue marble. So the city lights image would be also in the tradition of environment protection. In this case, environment protection would be by protecting dark skies at night. And this could be, which what Preacher says, that it could be, of course, a legit way of trying to protect the environment. The problem is that this data is usually presented as neutral, as self-explicative, and also as objective, right? As if any politics were involved. But what she argues is that this image, it's that much about a light pollution image as it is a light poverty image. So instead of reading it as light pollution, we can also read it as lack of electric light, which can be an indicative of poor regions, for example, as we see here on Africa, that on top of that, they also eliminated the natural light sources, right? So what she argues then is that this way of conceiving the environment as light pollution instead of light poverty has some implications. And the proposal that they make about conserving dark skies also hides some of the problems related with neocolonial practices of trying to preserve areas in poorer regions in the name of securing, for example, leisure or tourism coming from wealthier countries. So with this case study, as I was saying before, it is important to know which was the historical context when NASA published this image, who published it, why, and what were the practices involved in making this image of the Earth at night. And with this, we can see how the way that satellite data was displayed has an influence on how we act and how we conceive the environment. In this case, light poverty or light pollution. We have many other examples coming also from visual studies. For example, here on the left, we have a legend from a map that it was negotiated between Filipino and Swedish scientists over how to classify satellite land uses from satellite data. And here, I would like to highlight this case study that it was investigated by the historian Johan Gardebo, because he showed that not only had implications on how they conceive the environment, but they really had practical implications on how this land would later be managed by the Filipino government, no? And also here on the right, more related to climate science, Sebastian Gremskull investigated how the way that scientists displayed data in this graph here on the top in 1985 had a strong impact on the way to frame the ozone depletion data as an ozone hole, something that was very characteristic to channel the movement towards protecting and overcoming this ozone hole. So up until now, we have seen how visual analysis of satellite data can help us more critically understand data, but now I would like to turn on other practices that are involved in satellite data studies, as for example, production and data sharing. For this case, I would like to explain this case study investigated by Gemma Sira Claveras, which is the director also of Climasat, in an article that she published in 2018 that it's called The Weather Privateers, Meteorology and Commercial Satellite Data. So this article tries to answer the main question around how the commercialization of weather data in the US affects both how we conceive and act on the climate today. And it starts more or less around 2000s, and it revolves around which were the practices to privatize satellite data production in concretely this radio occultation data that we have this satellite here, that what this satellite does is it emits radio waves that are depleted and deflected by the atmosphere, and then some other satellites collect this data, and through measurement of the angle, they can infer which kind of atmospheric properties has the atmosphere that the radio waves have crossed. So in 2000s, the weather activities have had private sector presence, for example, since the late 19th centuries in the construction and selling of measurement instruments. In the 2000s, the production of satellite data, radio occultation satellite data, was mainly done through state vendors organized by NOAA, which is the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration in the United States. But as Gemma investigated, this production of satellite data experienced a rise in privatization since 1980s up to today. So, for example, in what she investigated, that she found 4 different periods or decades where this commercialization of production of weather data changed. And for example, starting in 1980s, she saw that the first attempts that Reagan tried to privatize not only weather production data, but also some other space activities, though he tried to do it and sometimes he succeeded, for example, in the case of Earth remote sensing data, the scientists finally could avoid it. And in 1985, NOAA established an open data policy that, though in some cases it can still proliferate privatization of weather forecasting, as data that it's produced by satellites must be shared freely and only at the cost of reproduction, this prevented the private sector to engage in satellite data production activities because the revenue would be distributed freely. Here, again, posing the emphasis in the relevance of studying data sharing practices. Then in 2000s, there was a beginning of a shift towards privatization because Konrad Lautenbacher was appointed as director of NOAA, and he had a strong relation with the private sector, and he began to explore different possibilities to how to privatize weather satellite data production, involving also the Congress and the allocation of funds to develop some initial projects towards investigating this end. But the real shift and the real push towards privatization of data started in 2010, after Barack Obama posed an act that enhanced the privatization of different space activities. And through this act, the private sector what saw is that, okay, if TV communications and maybe GPS or some other of space activities are being privatized, why not weather data collection, right? So in 2010 started what is known as data wars, that it's a period of time that spans perhaps until 2016-17, where the Congress, scientists, and the private sector engaged in kind of a strong battle and negotiation between which would be whether data should be privatized or not. On one side, scientists said that besides the ethical reasons of, for example, having to pay for a forecast on where Katrina hurricane would impact, they also were concerned with if data would be collected privately, how the scientific community could assess the quality of this data. And besides the quality, they were also concerned because climate science very much relates to the need to collect the climate data for a period of many years and to store it and to maintain it. But as these activities perhaps don't have that much economic revenue, they were concerned that if weather data production would be transferred to the private sector, then climate scientists could no longer do their job. On the other side, the private sector said that they could provide weather data at a way lower price and also at a better quality. The problem is that at the moment they didn't have any satellite orbiting, and so they didn't have any real example to show that this data was in fact with better quality and a lower price. And when scientists were asking this private sector to provide this information, they were saying that they could not share it because, of course, it was an industrial secret. And finally, together with this, the private sector kept questioning NOAA management capabilities. And in this case, it aligned with the tendency of the Congress since 1983, as we have seen, of privatizing other space activities. So after many battles and negotiations and also a public campaign on media to undermine the work of scientists, in the end, the private sector and the Congress achieved to award contracts to these 2 enterprises that we see here, that it's GeoOptics and Spire Global Inc., to collect radio occultation data. So after these contracts were signed, none of these two enterprises could provide data yet. And in 2017, when Trump won the elections, he directed NOAA to integrate commercial weather data to all their forecasts. So here we see that indeed the privatization move was still increasing. But only 2 months later, NOAA determined that this commercial data didn't have enough quality. But again, only 1 month later, the Barry Myers, that is the CEO of AccuWeather, and was appointed as NOAA director. So the attempt to launch state weather satellites that would provide the weather data with the quality that scientists were demanding, in the end, it was diminished and privatization continued. So after these moves in 2017, we continue into this privatization era. And this brings us to the state of today, and which is the conception and kind of actions that this historical investigation reveals, right? So on the one hand, we can see here on the left the title of a publication in Scientific American that it's just from the 7th of March, that they criticize that Trump is saying that climate alarmists are investing a lot of money in trying to make weather data a public endeavor, and he's trying to privatize and to keep privatizing all this weather data. So this reveals that nowadays, after this historical move that we have, that Gemma investigated, environment, or in this case, weather, is treated more as a tradable commodity than, for example, a common for everyone that it used to be the hegemonic way of treating weather data. And also what she argues is that this trend of seeing weather as a tradable community is also linked and also reflects other moves towards how we conceive environment nowadays as more of a marketable place, where, for example, market solutions are proposed to environmental issues such as habitat and species protection, climate change, or carbon emissions, as we see here from this picture. So with this example, I wanted to say again what we were saying with the preacher case, but in this case, not only on how the satellite data is displayed, but also on how other practices such as commercialization, sharing, and quality assessment, for example, can also play a role on and can help us understand how we conceive and act on the climate today. This is one of the research that could be done at Climasat. I haven't explained today any of the specific Climasat research because they are still under development, but just to put some examples, we have here on the right, the research that is doing my colleague Hector Isern, that it's about how the European satellite EARTH-1 is informing how we conceive and act as well on the oceans and climate. And here on the left, it is what I'm working on, that it's on the satellite Spot, the French satellite Spot, and how it was used as a tool for promoting discourses and practices around aided development in Iberoamerica and in many other places during the 80s and the 90s. So up until now, I said I explained a little bit some case studies on how can we critically conceive data from taking tools from the history of science and technology. But now I wanted to change on what can we do? What can we do practically? Because here in the room, there are many scientists as well that work with data. So I thought this last section as trying to share what historians and what other scholars, as for example, these two data analysts, Catherine Ignacio and Lauren F. Klein, have proposed on how can we practically implement all this critical view to data in our daily work. And what they propose in this book is these 7 statements that some of them we have covered now. For example, examining and challenging power, we have already talked about that. We have as well this 3rd statement about elevating emotion and embodiment, where they call for data feminism or a data analysis that really teaches to value multiple forms of knowledge, including the knowledge that comes from people as living, feeling bodies in the world. here, for example, when I was preparing this talk, I thought about grants, and perhaps these other forms of knowledge could link also with other forms of heritage, or how data can also help us to conceive heritage as other ways as only material. We also have in this fourth statement on how to rethink binaries and hierarchies, because data has been and still is a strong tool to make cultural classification of individuals, and Ignacio and Klein challenges to revise this, and also embracing pluralism, considering context that we have already mentioned, and making labor visible. About this later statement, there are other practices, for example, in critical remote sensing or countermapping strategies, where they really state who is the one participating in producing this data set or making it displayable in a map or in other type of productions with satellite data or with data in general. For example, I wanted to share with you this map here that Sasha Engelman and her colleagues did about climate, and to see how things can be done differently, right? So in this case, this weather map was made with do-it-yourself antennas. So they really wanted to see how scientific data was collected. And to each point of the map, they also attached a more embodied explanation on how these people felt when taking the measurements, and linking it, for example, with their experiences on how have they experienced climate change in their areas. For example, seeing the leaves with a different color, or perhaps with more or less rain, or perhaps a difference in the biodiversity that surrounded the places that they were mapping with satellite data. So with this, I think that I have said everything. I will be very happy to answer any question and also to engage in the discussion. Thank you.